Okay, so I will start my talk today by going back in time approximately 20 years to the year of 1999, because in that year I became a student at the university. And back in those days, things were a bit different from now. I remember that when me and my fellow students went to, or were to dig into a subject, we looked in our textbooks. And if we did not find the answer to our questions in our textbooks, then we went to the library and looked at the textbooks that were present in the library. Of course, the internet existed in 1999, but as I remember, we mainly went to the internet when we wanted to find some kind of specific and detailed information that was present in scientific articles. One can say that for my learning 20 years ago, I would say that textbooks were the most important way for me to find information. But now, 20 years later, I'm not a student anymore, but I am a teacher instead. And when I look at how my students approach information today, we can see that, of course, they use textbooks as well as we did. But I have also, of course, realized that the digital information that we have around us is more important today. So the students today, they look in textbooks, but they also search the internet, and they look into different e-books, they look into web pages, they look on different movies that they can find on the net, and other things as well. So with this in mind, I've tried to reflect on how can I meet the students in the best way today. And a couple of years ago, I came across a method that is called flipped classroom that I've tried to use in my teaching. And one can say that, a flipped classroom can be performed in several different ways, but one way, or a general way of performing flipped classroom is that the teacher starts with adding a movie to somewhere on the internet, and the students are then supposed to watch this movie, and then there will be a follow-up seminar in class where the students are allowed to discuss or are supposed to discuss the contents of the movie with each other and with the teacher. And what is important in this is that in the seminar then we get an active learning process. And active learning, it means that the students, they are actively participating in the learning. We can do that in several different ways, but one way is through discussion. If we go to passive learning instead, passive learning means just that, what you have in an ordinary lecture where a teacher just tells a lot of information and the students are supposed to listen and not participate that much in the learning process. And what is important about this is also that active learning has been shown to be good for your learning. It has actually been shown that if you participate in active learning, or students that participate in active learning reach better examination results. So when I started to work with this flipped classroom model approximately 2 years ago, I started to focus on the seminars, because it's the seminars where we have the active learning. So my focus was to create as good seminars as possible. And now, 2 years later, when I have tried to use this flipped classroom in different ways, I've gained some experience about this, and I've not made any, scientific studies about this, about what happens in my classroom, but I have talked to my students and tried to understand what they think about this way of being taught. And I would say that in general, my students seem to like this way of teaching, the flipped classroom model. And they often comment on that they like to have movies, lectures as movies, because when you have your movie, you can pause it, you can rewind it, you can look at it several times, and they like this. And also, one thing that I have understood from the students is also that they look at the quality of the movies, and I have actually put quite a lot of effort in many of my movies to try to make them interesting and to use animations and make things move in the movies. And I have had sometimes during my seminars, I've had students that start the seminars by saying something like, "Okay, what you did in that movie that we saw for today, that was really cool." And I would say, of course, that is good for my self-confidence to hear from students that are almost 20 years younger than me that I make something that they think is cool. But we're not going to talk about me today. But what I think, I mean, if we look at what does this mean for the student, then one could argue that, okay, if a student comments on a movie like this and says that, okay, it was a really cool movie, then one could argue that this student maybe has lost focus and looks at the special effects instead of looking at the content of the movie. That could be one way. But I think that this is actually quite important, because for me, if a student says something like this, it means that the student has engaged in the movie and has enjoyed the movie. And I would say that, having a student that is engaged in a movie and has enjoyed a movie, that student must also have learned something from the movie. So I think it's a positive thing. So, if we look at, as I said, I've used the flipped classroom model for approximately 2 years, and in the beginning, I said I focused on the seminar part of the flipped classroom model. But now, 2 years later, when I've had this and I've talked with the students, I realized that the movies are also important. So the seminars are, of course, a crucial part, since that is the place where we have the active learning. But the movies, I think now, is just as crucial as the seminar part. Okay, so I think I will finally talk a bit about how I try to make my movies interesting for the students and how I use animations for this. So if we take an example, let's say that we would like to describe for someone that if we have a ball and then we add a force to this ball, then the ball will move. It's a simple example. So let's say that someone looks that up in a textbook. Then one can say that you could probably find maybe a picture like this, that you have a picture that is in 3 parts. In the upper part you have the ball. In the middle part you have an arrow that points to the ball, showing that we have some kind of force that are going to act on this ball. And in the lower part you have the ball that has moved a certain distance. So that is what you could find, or what you could find in a textbook regarding this. So if I want to do a movie about this, what I would do is that I would not use 3 pictures like this, but I would instead do like this, that I would start with the first picture, but then instead of adding the 2 new pictures, I can actually, by animations, induce a movement of the ball. So I add the force, and then I can, by an animation, make the ball move instead. So this is a quite simple animation, and I'm sure that many people can do this animation much better than I can. But I think that just by adding this movement to the ball in a movie is something that could make students more enthusiastic when they look at the movies, that something is actually moving on the screen. So that might catch some students' attention. And would also say that I think that, I mean, this way of presenting things could be complementary to each other. So let's say that we have a student that first looks at a textbook and finds the the picture divided in 3 parts that I have on the left side of the screen, and then they watch my movie about the same thing. Then, I mean, they get 2 different ways of presenting the same thing. They get it first as static pictures and then as some kind of moving pictures. And I think this could be complementary to each other. So, and a good way to learn. And finally, in my opinion, I would say that this is quite similar to, I mean, the way we describe things for each other orally. Because if I want to describe something orally to a person, and that person doesn't understand what I say, then I try to use another way of saying it. So this is the same thing, I would say. We just use 2 different ways of explaining the same thing, which to increase the probability that the person that we tell this will understand it. So, thank you for listening to my presentation.